In this video, we will go over photosynthesis and cellular respiration. These are the standards we will be covering, and these are the objectives you should master by the end of the class. All right, let's get started on our journey. You all know that plants perform photosynthesis, and some of you might also know that plants also perform cellular respiration, or at least one type of cellular respiration. We will learn about all the types of cellular respiration and about the steps of photosynthesis. But before we do that, we need to talk about something very important as well. We are going to be dealing with several chemical equations. We're going to look at the chemical equation for photosynthesis and for the three types of cellular respiration we're going to talk about. And there is a standard way that you set up a chemical equation. So you're going to have your reactants, which are the molecules that react. They are the ones that are going to start the chemical reaction. And you have your products, which are the chemicals that are produced by your chemical reaction. Okay, and you always put them in the same way. You always put the reactants on the left hand side, separated by pluses, followed by an arrow, and the products. It's the standard way that we write down chemical equations. It's very important that as we go along, you keep in mind what are the reactants for cellular respiration, what are the reactants for photosynthesis, and what are the products of both processes. Photosynthesis is very simple, right? You get energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the ground. And the plant processes all of these in order to produce oxygen and what else? So oxygen is actually a waste product for the plant. It doesn't really need it, or it makes too much more than it needs, so it excretes it. It expels it as a waste product. What the plant really wants out of this is glucose, which is the other product of photosynthesis. So it's going to, again, take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground from its roots. Remember, the carbon dioxide is absorbed in the leaves through the stomata, and it's going to process solar energy, which is also processed by the leaves, but the top part instead of the bottom this time. And it's going to produce glucose, which is what it actually wants, because with glucose you can make ATP, and oxygen, which it expels as a waste product. This is another view to remember. You need to know both the word equation and the actual chemical equation. Sunlight can also be replaced with energy or solar energy, or even just a Greek delta, which looks like a triangle. Those are all ways that you can see this in a chemical equation. Now, the important thing, it's glucose, right? We've talked about glucose since the beginning of the year. Glucose is C6H12O6, and these are all different representations of glucose. You need to know the chemical formula of glucose. So C6H12O6. Remember that since glucose it's a carbohydrate, more specifically a monosaccharide, it has that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen structure and the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, right? So 1 to 2 to 1. You got twice as much hydrogen as carbon and oxygen. Already talked about the fact that carbon dioxide is absorbed by the cells. Notice that this is the bottom part of the leaf cells, and the stomata are going to perform gas exchange by absorbing carbon dioxide, and they're also going to expel the oxygen once it's done, and it also gets rid of the water as water vapor. The magic actually happens inside this structure. This structure is called a chloroplast. We're not going to go too deep into, but you know that chloroplasts are the organelles within the plant cells that perform photosynthesis, and the actual process is going to go in these little stacks, which some people say looks like pancakes. To me, it's always looked like a very futuristic, kind of like Jetson style city. And then like each thylakoid is going to be a different house. But and that's just me. I read way too much sci-fi. So these thylakoids are stacked up in what's called the granum, and all those granae are inside the chloroplast, which is filled with a liquid called the stroma. And these thylakoids are going to process sunlight, and they're going to turn that radiant energy or that thermal energy into chemical energy that can be used in the process of photosynthesis. Now, cellular respiration is going to occur for plants right after. So plants are autotrophs. They make their own glucose so they can go and perform cellular respiration. We are heterotrophs. We need to eat food, and one of the things we get out of that food is glucose from anything that you eat with sugar. That's why people get hyper when they have too much sugar, or some people. Um, because you use glucose to make ATP. And this process is called cellular respiration. Here is a more detailed way, a more detailed process of cellular respiration. So you're going to have the glucose, and you're going to start with glycolysis. It's the first of 4 steps of cellular respiration. Then they're going to produce pyruvate, and that's going to go through pyruvate oxidation, which is going to go into the mitochondria, and now you're going to go through the other steps of cellular respiration. So you're going to go through pyruvate oxidation, which is the first one, then the Krebs cycle, and then finally the electron transport chain, which is where the oxygen comes in. So you're going to use that oxygen in order to kind of pick up extra electrons. It's called being an electron acceptor, and that's how you're going to produce that ATP within the mitochondria. Take a closer look at the equation itself. Again, you're going to get oxygen, or O2. Remember, O2 is oxygen gas. Oxygen, atomic oxygen by itself, just the O, doesn't really exist because it's not stable enough. That's why it binds to another oxygen, and it naturally exists as oxygen gas, or O2. Then you're going to use sugar, more specifically glucose, which is C6H12O2. You're going to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. So ATP is that one really important molecule that holds energy within our body. This all happens again in the mitochondria. So inside the mitochondria, you get cellular respiration, most of it. The first one, glycolysis, happens outside, and then everything moves into the mitochondria. Let's take a closer look at ATP. We've looked at it before. Let's look at it a little bit more. So ATP has 3 main parts: the adenine, a ribose sugar, and the 3 phosphate groups. We said that it's a modified nucleotide, which it looks a lot like it. Anyways, now the important parts are these two bonds, where you have these two phosphate bonds. These bonds are very unstable. And by unstable, that means that they're also high energy. So these are very strained bonds. And when these bonds are broken, it releases energy. So this energy is the energy that ATP provides for chemical reactions. And it's going to happen when they break these two bonds. So each ATP has two charges. So in order to release the energy contained within ATP, you got to break this phosphate bonds. And once you break the phosphate bond between an ATP molecule, then it's going to release all that energy. See a little starburst in behind it, and that energy, it's going to be used for something else. Now the other phosphate group is going to be grabbed back and added um, to the molecule again through cellular respiration, which is what it actually does. It doesn't really create the ATP molecule, it reloads it, it recharges it, it reattaches the broken phosphates. So you break one off, and now you have ADP, adenosine diphosphate. You have two phosphates. And this molecule can still provide some energy, right? You still have one of the two high energy bonds. So you can break it one more time, and you end up with AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. And adenosine monophosphate is going to be kind of like a spent battery. So adenosine monophosphate is going to be taken back to the mitochondria, and it's going to get charged in the electron transport chain when they reattach some phosphates to rebuild the ATP molecule. It's really, really important that you understand that these processes feed off of each other. So if you take a closer look, the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of cellular respiration, more or less, the energy changes. And the products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cellular respiration. That's why plants first must perform photosynthesis, and then they can do cellular respiration to ultimately produce ATP. But we need to eat food to extract the glucose, and we need to breathe to get the oxygen in order to have all of the ingredients to produce ATP. Again, we are heterotrophs. That means we need to eat in order to obtain these nutrients, and plants are autotrophs, which means that they can produce their own glucose, and they do so through photosynthesis. It's kind of like a big cycle. That's why we don't run out of oxygen even though we keep breathing it in, because plants keep producing more of it. And plants don't run out of carbon dioxide even though they keep taking it in, because animals and other aerobic organisms keep producing carbon dioxide. In fact, we're very good at producing carbon dioxide. We got a lot of that in the atmosphere. Now, if oxygen is not present, how does the molecule actually get ATP? So how does the cell get ATP if there's no oxygen? A lot of cells would die because they don't have the alternate mechanism, but some cells have adapted to form aerobic respiration, and they're going to do one of two types of fermentation. So they're still going to use glucose, but instead of oxygen, they'll have another chemical that would take its place. And we're going to look at it a little bit more. So there are two main types of fermentation, or anaerobic respiration. There is a type of fermentation that's taking place within the muscles of this gentleman over here. When you work out, you do a really hard workout, you are sore after. Your muscles are kind of achy because they are deprived of oxygen. So since your blood cannot deliver enough oxygen to your muscles to do the workout you're doing, then the muscles are going to go the alternate route. They're going to start doing anaerobic respiration to produce at least some ATP. And that's going to produce also lactic acid, which accumulates in your muscles, and that's what hurts. That's what makes you sore. The other one is alcohol fermentation. So our cells don't do that. Otherwise, people would go to the gym and come back a little bit drunk. But alcohol fermentation is done by prokaryotic organisms like bacteria, which also do lactic acid fermentation, and by some other eukaryotic organisms like yeast. We're going to talk a little bit more about the classification of organisms later in class, but yeast is a microscopic fungus, it's a very small fungus, and it produces alcohol. That's how we make a lot of the alcoholic drinks. It also makes bread. So lactic acid fermentation happens in mostly the muscles of animal cells, and some bacteria perform it too. That's how we make cheese and all that fun stuff. In alcohol fermentation, it's going to be done by yeast. So these are some, this is an example of yeast. This is baking yeast, which is used to bake bread. So when you bake the bread, the yeast is doing its thing and produces some alcohol, which bakes off, it evaporates off the bread. But the bubbles in the bread, like the little bubbles that you see inside, are carbon dioxide bubbles from the leftovers of alcohol fermentation. We also talked about lactic acid fermentation done by bacteria. So all of those dairy products that we have, so your nice mozzarella cheese and all of your types of cheese and yogurts and all of that fun stuff, that's done by a bacterium which starts fermenting the sugars in the milk, and it produces an acidic substance which causes all of this to happen, and that's lactic acid. Here's a little bit of a comparison in between the two of aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration is a lot more efficient. That's why it's preferred over anaerobic respiration. So you see that it makes 34, sometimes 32 even, to 38 ATP molecules per one glucose molecule. Aerobic respiration only makes about 2 per glucose molecule. So you get a lot more bang for your buck when you're doing aerobic respiration. We said that it's performed by eukaryotic, and some prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms are going to do anaerobic respiration, whereas mostly eukaryotic organisms are aerobic. We also said that aerobic respiration, it starts in the cytosol and then it moves into the mitochondria, and aerobic respiration happens entirely in the cytosol. It never gets to the mitochondria because it's not doing those steps. And anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. So things that are deprived of oxygen are going to perform anaerobic respiration, sometimes as an alternative to aerobic respiration. Which uses oxygen as a final electron acceptor. And here you have all of the chemical equations for all 4 processes that we've discussed. So you have photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water plus solar energy. It's going to produce glucose and oxygen. And then you have aerobic respiration, which we've been calling cellular respiration. Now you know that it's the most common one, but it's not the only one. You have going to use glucose and oxygen to produce ATP, which is your main thing, then carbon dioxide and water are other 2 byproducts. And the products of this is going to be just glucose, and it's going to be modified. It's taken through a process, and it's going to produce lactic acid and ATP. In alcohol fermentation, you're also going to start with glucose and you're going to break it down in a different process in order to produce alcohol, in this case ethanol, and carbon dioxide. So remember, lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation are alternatives to aerobic respiration. They're anaerobic ways to produce ATP when oxygen is not available. They're a little bit different from each other. So and you need to be able to differentiate them. But basically, the biggest thing is that lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid as a waste product, as a byproduct, and alcohol fermentation produces, surprisingly, alcohol as a byproduct. And that's the main one.